Imagine the scene. You are in the northwest of the United States, right in the middle of an arid landscape, several thousand kilometers from the nearest sea. When suddenly, a wall of water, a wave several dozen meters high, rises on the horizon, carrying with it icebergs and sediments. It moves through the landscape at nearly 130 kilometers per hour with the unstoppable force of a steamroller. This isn't the pitch for a big-budget movie with a weak script, but rather the description of one of the many mega-floods, a kind of tsunami that formed on the continents. 19,000 to 16,000 years ago, when several times a huge glacial lake suddenly emptied. The evidence of these gigantic waves is written in the landscapes of the American Northwest, where we find, imprinted in the rocks, striking patterns that only the unleashed raw forces of nature are capable of creating. In some places, the ground is scraped, as if carved by the hands of eccentric giants. Elsewhere, whole cliff sections have been ripped off. There, carved canyons. Here, monstrous blocks deposited in the middle of nowhere. And sometimes, at the top of certain landforms, we even find deposits that are usually typical of those found on beach shores. To try to understand how such structures could have been sculpted, we need to set the scene. Hold on tight, it's truly daunting. We're nearing the end of the last ice age, just under 20,000 years ago. And with the gradual warming of the globe, the thick ice sheets of Europe and North America began to melt. And the water, which sometimes remained trapped there as ice for tens of thousands of years, began to flow down the landscape and make its way to the sea. Though it didn't always make it there. Because it's not uncommon for these meltwaters to encounter obstacles they can't overcome as they move along. Such as the one raised to the west of the American continent by the immense Cordilleran ice sheet, whose one tongue of ice flowing south formed a natural dam about 40 kilometers long and over 600 meters high. A natural dam upstream of which, inexorably, the meltwaters kept flowing in and accumulated in the valleys. To the point that, in western Montana, they eventually formed a vast prehistoric lake named Missoula. This giant, unable to drain, filled up to the brim with water, meltwater, icebergs, and debris, until it reached its maximum extent, over about 7,700 square kilometers, which is 15 times larger than Lake Geneva. For decades at most, only a few thin streams, laboriously making their way under the wall of ice blocking the outlet, managed to escape. Until the titanic pressures exerted by the 2,100 cubic kilometers of meltwater trapped inside. That's a volume about 60 times greater than what is currently held back by the Hoover Dam, eventually overcoming the massive tongue of ice blocking the passage. And then, with an apocalyptic grinding sound, the cliffs blocking the monstrous amounts of water held in Missoula suddenly gave way, and the result was truly cataclysmic. After breaking through the barrier, hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of liquid water, along with huge blocks of ice from the broken dam, torn from the glacier by the force of the floodwaters, began to surge westward every second, sweeping across the landscape for hundreds of kilometers. By relying on the size of the debris moved by the disaster. It is estimated that the flow of this ancient torrent must have fluctuated between 5 and 20 times that of the Amazon River during flood season. Enough to practically empty Lake Missoula in just a few days at most. While it will take nearly 3 weeks for this ephemeral water monster to finally reach the sea. Even today, the traces of this flood, whose flow was momentarily equal in volume to that of all the rivers and streams in the world combined, are imprinted everywhere it passed. From the state of Washington, through western Oregon, passing through the Columbia River Gorge, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, surging across the arid western United States, these torrents of water could have initially formed a wall nearly 100 meters high, and which sped down the slopes at nearly 100 km/h, validating all the superlatives. Because this deluge, carrying millions of tons of rocks and sediments torn away in its path, left a mark on the land by stripping away its very surface. Even today, these parts of the landscape, where the loose soil has been stripped away, are literally visible from space here. In the northeast of the state of Washington, you can see wide areas, in some places 100 kilometers across, that have been literally stripped bare by the passage of the waves. Almost nothing grows there anymore. By ripping up every bit of gravel from the loose earth below as it moved, the torrent gained abrasive power and turned into an avalanche of water, mud, and sediment. It gained the ability to score, scrape, plane, and occasionally reduce entire sections and stone landscapes to rubble in its path. It is believed that, in the state of Washington, no less than 200 cubic kilometers of rock were ripped from the ground by these floods, before being deposited hundreds of kilometers downstream. When the floodwaters had lost enough power and these hellish flows were not only carrying sediments, they also carried with them thousands of icebergs that previously floated in the lake or were torn from the ruptured dams. And sometimes, where their journey ended, they left behind huge blocks of rock that they could carry. In this way, blocks weighing up to 200 tons have been found on hilltops in western Oregon, and they were deposited there not by eccentric gods, but by the raging waters of cataclysmic floods, carrying with them huge icebergs from glaciers that sometimes, along their path, could incorporate gigantic blocks of stone. The walls of water left their marks and scars wherever they passed. At the level of dry fall, there's an abrupt break, 5 times wider and twice as high as Niagara Falls, which were shaped and carved by the passage of these kinds of fleeting tsunamis of water, ice, and gravel. And in the rock, you can see the flow patterns carved by turbulent, sediment-rich water, capable of scraping and extruding the earth. And while today these falls are almost dry here, in the past, for just a few days at most, the largest waterfalls in the world existed. As shown by this absolutely stunning computer simulation, you can see the modeling of one of these mega floods passing through this famous break. Here, at the level of Great Blade, the passage of the overwhelming power of the waters sculpted the landscape, almost cutting it in two, leaving just a thin portion of rock standing in the center, which was able to withstand the passage of the torrents. Do these strange formations owe their existence to the successive passage of 2 brutal floods that carved the rock with their force? That was about 15,000 years ago, leaving behind stretches pitted and streaked with scars that will take millions of years to heal. Elsewhere, you can find them dozens of meters above the current level of the river. Holes several meters wide dug out, not by giant worms, but by the power of waves whose truly colossal size allowed them to reach this high plateau for a few hours. A plateau that was originally smooth, and from which the waves tore away the softer parts of the rock, forming kinds of small craters, potholes large enough to fit elephants inside. At times, these roaring waters, in their progress toward the ocean, were temporarily held back, slowed down by the presence of immense basins and depressions in the landscape that they had to fill, until they found an exit at the lowest topographical point, where they forced their way through any possible weak spots. Elsewhere, the fury of these waters carved furrows into the landscape with their rage, in some places as deep as 40-story buildings. As they moved forward, entire rivers were diverted, and small streams were turned into raging torrents. There, gigantic sand dunes were deposited. Here, originally, narrow gorges were deeply carved and widened until they became canyons as wide as the one that now holds the Columbia River. At the passage called Hualula Gap, where the torrential floodwaters coming from the east had to face a wall of high cliffs that tightly enclosed and restricted access to the west. Because, despite its impressive size, the Hualulaga Passage was still too narrow to drain all the water rushing every second into the vast plain, so that it was unable to get out as quickly as it would have liked. It accumulated in this topographical trap, quickly forming a vast, deep, temporary lake in just a few days. In some places, nearly 300 meters deep, Lake Lewis. This lake, as impressive in size as it was short-lived, and which, during the largest floods, overflowed across the surrounding plains, left behind geological traces so vast that they are still clearly visible from the sky. In just a few weeks at most, the waters of Lake Lewis drained completely toward the west. or one last time, unable to escape from a valley as quickly as they would like. They gave rise in the Portland area to one last temporary lake before finally flowing permanently into the ocean. Precisely where we found them in the canyon, plunging toward the deep ocean. Large quantities of rocks from the landscapes crossed by this deluge, like from the Missoula Formation Basin, located nearly 1,000 kilometers from there. But of all the traces left to us by these floods, the most visually strange are perhaps these moon-like fields, which owe their existence not to the presence of a desert, but to that of a lake that once covered this entire valley with several hundred meters of water, and whose memories are entirely contained in these floods. Thus, the apparent softness of these dunes covering the Great Plains of this region tells us a terrible story. Because these oscillation ridges, sometimes measuring 15 meters high and spaced several dozen meters apart, were all formed by current waves imprinted in the ground by the waters. The size and orientation of the formations at the time of their abrupt departure from the lake provide a clear picture of the forces and general direction of the currents. And this happened every time Lake Missoula suddenly drained. Because by studying the regions impacted by these floods, researchers have discovered in several places rhythmites of fine sediment deposits that formed at relatively regular intervals. And like the pages of a history book, they preserve the memory of each flood by giving us the tempo, frequency, and rhythm. Because in these regions, around 50 floods occurred and raged over nearly 3,000 years. At the level of the city of Missoula, the very one that gave its name to the giant lake. We also find shorelines drawn on the slopes of the hills overlooking the valley. These strange horizontal bands were left by the movement of the lake's waves produced by the winds. These waves, as they gently lapped the shore, left their mark on it, thus leaving us with a wealth of information about these size variations, these phases of draining and filling. In the past, absolutely everything below these lines was temporarily submerged under several hundred meters of water. All these are pieces of evidence that prove the immense Lake Missoula was as short-lived as it was capable of rising from its ashes. These hellish floods were also characterized by their recurrence. And after a flood had poured into the ocean, it often took only a short time before everything started all over again. After each break in the ice dam, it quickly reformed, fed by glaciers coming from the north. Then, once again deprived of an outlet, the lake, fed by meltwater, would fill up in a few decades before everything started all over again. Until, with the warming, the retreat of the ice sheet further north finally put an end to these floods from another era. To this day, these series of Missoula floods remain the most destructive and powerful whose traces have been identified on Earth. Just think that the most intense of these events shaped the landscapes they crossed in just a few days more deeply than tens of thousands of years of rain ever could, leaving behind landscapes of desolation, covering a total area as vast as Belgium. And I find it crazy to think that these kinds of tsunamis, which raged right in the middle of the continents, actually happened just a blink of an eye away from here. Given the immensity of geological time, these landscapes that seem to come from another era were even walked upon by some of our ancestors. They laid eyes on them, certainly amazed. Because these megafloods all occurred when Homo sapiens was likely already populating a large part of North America's territories. And perhaps even more astonishing, these gigantic flows indirectly helped to revive an old idea. Because when, in the 1920s, the American geologist Harlan Bretz tried to explain the enigmatic presence of all these formations and other deposits. By suggesting the possibility that floods of epic proportions had occurred here, his colleagues treated him with a certain disdain, if they didn't outright consider him crazy. At that time, most geologists believed that past phenomena could only be seriously understood and explained based on those observable in the present. The dominant school of thought at the time was called uniformitarianism. It supported the idea that landscapes could only have been shaped and formed gradually over very long periods of time. And it was thought at the time that, except for sudden volcanic eruptions or occasional river floods, all transformations were slow and gradual, taking place over long periods, just as rain can over several thousand years overcome the resistance of rock. Yet, no one had ever witnessed floods of the magnitude that Bretz supposed existed, and practically everyone refused to even consider the idea that such an event could be possible. It must be said that at the time, people still remembered, sometimes bitterly, a period when catastrophism was the dominant school of thought, and when people often tried, without much success, to explain the origin of landscapes by invoking meteorite impacts and volcanic eruptions. Were not based on events, the Bible, or other mythology. As a result, Aubre's hypothesis unintentionally echoed the old demons of the past. And despite the growing body of evidence showing that waves had violently swept over these landscapes, the vast majority of geologists didn't want to hear about it. Until finally, after several decades and faced with the mountain of accumulated evidence, the truth eventually became undeniable. Eventually, people accepted that the force and fury of extraordinary events could, on rare occasions, tear through the past. And in just a few hours, have as much impact on the surface of the world as the slow and relentless erosion caused by rain or the abrasion by winds. And just to end on a note of gigantism, keep in mind that even though the Missoula floods transformed the landscapes they passed through, aren't they still relatively modest? At least in terms of volume, if we compare them to those caused by another giant lake, Lake Agassiz, whose outflows at times were 4 times greater, and which not only reshaped the landscapes in its path, but also changed the climate of a large part of the world. I'll talk to you more about this other titan in a future episode. In the meantime, I hope that taking a mental walk through these great catastrophes has touched your heart a little. And that maybe you'll look at the landscapes near your home with more interest, and which very certainly also hide, buried within them, fabulous stories. If you liked this video, let me know and check out the linked playlist above and below. You'll find many other delightful landscapes from our planet's past there. And if you want to learn more about the insane Missoula floods, you have the book and the website by Bruce Norman Bjornstad, whose link I've put in the description. It's thanks to him that I was able to show you all those drone shots of the regions crossed by the floods. A big thank you to you, Bruce. Subtitling 501.